The blood dripped down her back in thin rivers of crimson, soaking through the torn fabric of her dress as Georgia Rose struggled to remain standing against the wooden post in the center of Murphy's Town Square. 20 lashes they had given her, each one delivered with brutal precision by the overseer from the Hutchinson plantation. And her crime had been nothing more than teaching 3 enslaved children to read simple words from a primer she had kept hidden beneath the floorboards of the schoolhouse. It was 1861, and California might have entered the Union as a free state 11 years prior, but there were still men who kept people in bondage under various schemes and threats, and the law turned a blind eye when it suited those with money and influence. Georgia had known the risk when she first agreed to help young Samuel, his sister Ruth, and their cousin Thomas learned their letters in the quiet hours after sunset. She was only 22 years old, an educated woman from Boston who had come west seeking adventure and purpose, and she had found employment as the schoolteacher in this gold rush town, nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The children had come to her with eyes full of hope, speaking in whispers about how they wanted to read the Bible for themselves, wanted to write letters, wanted to taste the freedom that came with literacy. She could not turn them away, not when she had spent her whole life believing that education was a fundamental right that belonged to every human soul. But someone had seen them through the schoolhouse window 3 nights ago. Someone had told Mr. Hutchinson, the wealthy mine owner who claimed to employ the children's parents, but kept them in conditions that amounted to slavery in everything but name. And Mr. Hutchinson had demanded justice, calling for the town marshal and half the prominent citizens to witness what happened to those who interfered with his property and his rights. The whipping had happened at dawn, with Georgia tied to the post and her back bared to the morning air. She had bitten through her bottom lip trying not to scream, refusing to give the gathered crowd the satisfaction of hearing her break. Now, as the sun climbed higher and the heat of the California summer day began to press down on the town square, she could barely focus her eyes. Her legs trembled beneath her weight, threatening to give out entirely. "Cut her down," a voice said, deep and commanding, cutting through the murmur of the dispersing crowd. "This has gone on long enough." Georgia tried to turn her head to see who was speaking, but the movement sent a fresh wave of agony across her shoulders. She heard the sound of boots approaching, steady and purposeful, and then the pressure around her wrists suddenly released as someone cut through the ropes that had bound her to the post. She started to fall, her legs finally giving way, but strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. "I have got you," the voice said, closer now, and she found herself looking up into a face that was weathered by sun and wind but surprisingly young. He could not have been more than 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was a gentleness in how he held her despite the obvious strength in his arms, and she saw a muscle jump in his jaw as he got his first clear look at her injuries. What kind of men do this to a woman for the crime of teaching? The kind who fear educated slaves more than they fear God, Georgia managed to whisper, though speaking took effort she barely had to spare. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges, darkness creeping in from all sides. The man turned his head to address someone in the crowd. "You should all be ashamed standing by while this happened. She is a better person than any of you." "Now see here, Zachary," another voice protested, older and full of bluster. "That woman broke the rules. She knew what she was doing was wrong, teaching those people to read. It only gives them ideas above their station." "There are no slaves in California, Mayor," Zachary replied, his voice hard as iron. "Or have you forgotten the laws of this state? Those children have every right to learn to read, and Miss Rose here was doing the Lord's work in teaching them. Georgia wanted to thank him, wanted to say something in response to his defense of her actions, but the darkness was winning its battle against her consciousness. She felt herself slipping away, heard voices arguing in the distance, and then there was only the sensation of being lifted and carried, cradled against a broad chest that smelled of leather and sage and horses. When she woke again, she was lying on her stomach on a soft bed in a room she did not recognize. Late afternoon, light slanted through a window, painting golden squares across wooden floorboards that were clean and well swept. Someone had removed her torn dress and replaced it with a loose cotton nightgown, and she could feel the sting of salve on her wounds, the pull of bandages wrapped carefully around her torso. "You are awake," a woman's voice said, kind and warm. An older woman with silver-streaked hair and a weathered face appeared in Georgia's limited field of vision, setting down a basin of water on a nearby table. "Good. You gave us quite a scare, sleeping so long. I am Martha Winston. My nephew Zachary brought you to our ranch this morning." "Where am I?" Georgia asked, her voice hoarse. "The Winston Ranch, about 3 miles outside of Murphy's," Martha replied, wringing out a cloth and carefully wiping Georgia's face. "Zachary was in town picking up supplies when he saw what they were doing to you. He was furious, and my nephew does not get angry easily. He carried you straight to his horse and brought you here, told me to take care of you, and said you would be staying with us until you recovered." "He should not have interfered," Georgia said, though even as she spoke the words, she was grateful beyond measure that he had. "Mr. Hutchinson will be angry. He might cause trouble for your family." Martha made a dismissive sound. "Let him try. The Winstons have been in these mountains since before most of these newcomers showed up chasing gold. We run cattle and horses, we mind our own business, and we do not bow to bullies like Hutchinson. Zachary was right to bring you here, and you are safe now. That is all that matters." Tears pricked at Georgia's eyes, the first she had allowed herself since the whole ordeal began. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not know what would have happened if he had not come when he did." "Nothing good," Martha said grimly. "Now you rest. I will bring you some broth in a little while. You need to keep your strength up. Those wounds will heal, but it will take time." Over the following days, Georgia existed in a haze of pain and gradual recovery. Martha tended to her wounds with practiced skill, changing bandages and applying salve twice daily. The older woman explained that she had learned frontier medicine out of necessity, having raised her nephew and her own children in these mountains far from proper doctors. Georgia was grateful for her knowledge and her gentle touch. It was 3 days before Georgia was strong enough to sit up without feeling dizzy, and nearly a week before she could stand and walk around the room for short periods. Throughout it all, she caught only occasional glimpses of Zachary, seeing him through the window as he worked with horses in the corral or rode out with ranch hands to check on cattle. He came to the house each evening, and she could hear his voice in the other room speaking with Martha, asking about Georgia's condition. But he did not come to see her directly, giving her privacy and space to heal. Finally, on the 8th day after the whipping, Georgia felt well enough to dress in one of the simple calico dresses Martha had provided and make her way out of the bedroom. She moved slowly, still stiff and sore, but the wounds were closing and the worst of the pain had subsided to a dull ache. She found Martha in the kitchen, working on preparations for supper. "Well, look at you," Martha said with a warm smile. "It is good to see you up and about. How are you feeling?" "Better," Georgia replied honestly. "Thanks to your care. I do not know how I can ever repay your kindness." "No repayment necessary," Martha assured her. "Though I must warn you, Zachary has been talking about something, and I expect he will want to discuss it with you now that you are recovering." Before Georgia could ask what she meant, the back door opened and Zachary himself walked in, pulling off his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. His eyes went immediately to Georgia, and she saw relief flash across his features as he took in her improved condition. "Miss Rose," he said, nodding respectfully, "it is good to see you on your feet. I hope you are feeling better." "I am, Mr. Winston," she replied, suddenly aware of how she must look with her hair simply braided and wearing a borrowed dress. "And I owe you an enormous debt. You saved my life." "Zachary," he corrected, "and you owe me nothing. I did what any decent person should have done." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "But I do need to talk to you about something important. Will you sit with me on the porch? The evening air is pleasant." Georgia agreed, curious and a little nervous about what he wanted to discuss. They walked together to the front porch, where two rocking chairs waited. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The ranch stretched out before them, a valley of golden grass dotted with grazing cattle, surrounded by the rising slopes of pine-covered mountains. "This is beautiful," Georgia said softly, taking it all in. "It is home," Zachary replied, settling into one of the chairs. He waited until she had carefully lowered herself into the other before continuing. "I have been thinking about what happened to you in town, about those children you were teaching. Has anyone warned them? Do they know that you are all right?" Georgia's heart clenched. "I have been so focused on my own recovery that I had not thought about them. They must be terrified. Samuel is only 9 years old, Ruth is 7, and Thomas is 10. If they think they caused this, if they blame themselves." Her voice broke slightly. "I thought you might feel that way," Zachary said gently. "I spoke with their families 3 days ago, rode to the Hutchinson property after dark and talked to their parents. They know you are safe and recovering." The children were indeed blaming themselves, but their parents told them you would not want that you made your choice knowing the risks. Relief flooded through Georgia so intensely that fresh tears sprang to her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "I cannot tell you what it means to me that you did that." Zachary leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. "Miss Rose, Georgia, I need to ask you something. When you are fully healed, what will you do? You cannot go back to teaching in Murphy's. Hutchinson will be watching, and so will his allies. They will not let you near those children again, and they might try to punish you further if you stay in town." "I know," Georgia admitted, the reality of her situation settling heavily on her shoulders. "I have been trying not to think about it, but you are right. I suppose I will have to leave Murphy's entirely. Perhaps go back to Boston or try to find a teaching position in San Francisco. Or you could stay here," Zachary said quietly, "on the ranch, and you could keep teaching those children." Georgia stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "I have been thinking about this for days," Zachary explained, his words coming faster now as though he had been holding them back and they were finally being released. "The Hutchinson property borders our ranch on the southern edge. There is an old line shack there, a small cabin we use during spring roundup. It is on our land, but it is close enough to the border that those children could get there without being seen. You could teach them there in secret. You would be safe because you would be living here, on Winston property, where Hutchinson has no authority. You would shelter me and help me continue teaching them." Georgia could barely believe what she was hearing. "After what happened, after seeing what they did to me, you would risk bringing that anger down on your family." "I would," Zachary said simply. "Because what you were doing was right, and what they did to you was wrong. My father taught me that a man stands up for what is right, even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult, and Martha feels the same way. We talked about it, and we both agree. You should stay here and keep teaching those children." Georgia felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the evening sun and everything to do with the man sitting beside her. She had met many people in her life, had known men who spoke eloquently about justice and righteousness, but few who were willing to put their own safety on the line for their beliefs. Zachary Winston was different. He was a man of action, of quiet courage, and she found herself drawn to him in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "Say yes," he replied, and when he smiled at her, truly smiled, it transformed his whole face. "Say you will stay and keep teaching them. Say you will not let men like Hutchinson win." "Yes," Georgia said, her own smile matching his. "Yes, I will stay." The next few weeks established a new rhythm to Georgia's life. During the day, she helped Martha with household tasks, learning the routines of ranch life. She discovered that she enjoyed the physical work, found satisfaction in baking bread and tending the vegetable garden and hanging laundry to dry in the mountain breeze. Her wounds continued to heal, the angry red welts fading to pink scars that Martha assured her would eventually pale to white lines, barely visible. In the evenings, after supper was cleared away, Zachary began teaching Georgia to ride. He was patient and encouraging, showing her how to sit properly in the saddle, how to communicate with the horse through subtle shifts of weight and gentle pressure from her legs. They used a calm bay mare named Rosie, who seemed to understand that her rider was inexperienced and adjusted her pace accordingly. "You are a natural," Zachary told her one evening as they walked the horses back to the barn after a ride along the creek. "Most people who learn to ride as adults are tense in the saddle, fighting the horse instead of moving with her. But you have good instincts." "I had a good teacher," Georgia replied, and she saw pleasure flash in his eyes at the compliment. They had fallen into an easy companionship, their conversations ranging from light-hearted topics like the antics of the ranch dogs to more serious discussions about the brewing conflict between North and South. War seemed inevitable now, with states seceding and tensions mounting. Zachary worried about what it would mean for California, for the West, for the fragile progress that had been made on questions of freedom and human dignity. "My father fought in the Mexican-American War," he told her one night as they sat on the porch after a riding lesson. "He came home different, haunted by what he had seen. He died 5 years ago, and I think part of him never really came back from that war at all. The thought of another war, especially one where Americans fight Americans, makes me sick." "I feel the same way," Georgia said softly. "But I also know that some things are worth fighting for. Freedom is worth fighting for. The right of those children to learn to read, the right of people to not be owned by other people, those things matter enough to stand firm on, even if the cost is high." "You are braver than I am," Zachary said, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You have already paid a terrible price for your beliefs. I am just a rancher who talks big but has not really been tested." "You faced down the town when you defended me," Georgia reminded him. "You brought me here and offered to help me continue teaching, knowing it could bring trouble to your door. That takes courage." He reached out then, slowly enough that she could have moved away if she wanted to, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, warm and solid. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I would do it again in a heartbeat. Bringing you here was the best decision I have made in a long time." Georgia felt her breath catch in her throat. They had been dancing around something for weeks now, a growing attraction that manifested in stolen glances and accidental touches and conversations that lasted long into the night. But this was the first time either of them had acknowledged it directly. "I feel the same way," she admitted, letting her fingers curl around his. Being here with you and Martha, it has been like finding a home I did not know I was looking for." They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. It was a perfect moment, peaceful and full of promise, and Georgia wanted to hold on to it forever. 2 days later, Zachary rode to the Hutchinson property after nightfall to make arrangements with the families of Samuel, Ruth, and Thomas. He returned well after midnight and came to the kitchen where Georgia was waiting, unable to sleep until she knew he had returned safely. "It is all arranged," he told her, accepting the cup of coffee she poured for him. "The children will come to the line shack tomorrow night, 2 hours after sunset. Their parents will bring them as close as they dare, and I will meet them at the property line and guide them the rest of the way. You will have 2 hours with them, then I will take them back." "Thank you," Georgia said, emotion thick in her voice. "Thank you for making this possible." "Thank you for being willing to keep trying," he replied. "Their parents were so grateful, Georgia. The mothers were crying. They said you were a blessing, a gift from God. And when I told them you were willing to continue teaching despite everything, they could hardly believe it." That next evening, Georgia waited nervously in the line shack, which Zachary and some of the ranch hands had cleaned and furnished with a table, chairs, and oil lamps. She had her primer, slates for the children to practice writing, and a fierce determination to make this work. When Zachary arrived with the 3 children, Georgia had to fight back tears at the sight of them. Samuel, tall for his 9 years with serious dark eyes. Ruth, small and delicate with her hair in careful braids. Thomas, sturdy and quiet, watching everything with careful attention. They rushed to her the moment they saw her, all 3 trying to hug her at once, asking if she was all right, apologizing through their tears. "Hush now," Georgia said, embracing them all. "I am fine, see. I am healing well, and I am so happy to see you. We do not have much time tonight, so we need to start learning. Are you ready?" They were more than ready. They were eager, focused, soaking up every word she taught them like dry ground absorbing rain. In those 2 hours, they reviewed everything they had learned before the night they were discovered, and Georgia was pleased to see that they had retained most of it. She gave them each a small slate and a piece of chalk, gifts that Zachary had purchased for them in Sacramento during a supply run, and showed them how to practice their letters at home in secret. When it was time for them to leave, Ruth hugged Georgia tightly and whispered, "I am going to learn to read the whole Bible. I am going to make you proud." "You already make me proud," Georgia told her, smoothing down the little girl's braids. "All of you do. Now go, be safe, and I will see you again soon." After Zachary had taken the children back to the property line, he returned to the line shack to walk Georgia back to the main ranch house. The night was clear and cool, the path lit by a nearly full moon. "That was wonderful," Georgia said, still glowing from the success of the lesson. "They learned so much, Zachary. They are bright children with quick minds. Given the chance, they could do anything." "I know," he said softly. "I could see it in their faces tonight, the hunger for knowledge. It reminded me of you, actually. Me, the way you look when you teach them, like you are doing exactly what you were put on this earth to do, like you are fully alive." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Georgia, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," he said simply, his voice steady despite the enormity of the words. "I know we have only known each other for a few weeks, and I know you came here under terrible circumstances. I do not want to rush you or make you uncomfortable. But I cannot keep pretending that I do not feel this way. You are remarkable and brave and kind, and I think about you every moment of every day." Georgia felt joy bloom in her chest like a flower opening to the sun. "Zachary," she said, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the slight scratch of stubble beneath her palm. "I am falling in love with you too. I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was too soon, too complicated. But my heart does not care about any of that. It just knows what it wants." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, his hands cradling her face as though she were something precious and fragile. Georgia melted into the kiss, into him, feeling safe and cherished and completely alive. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, foreheads resting together. "Marry me," Zachary said. "I know it is fast, I know people will talk, but I do not care about any of that. I want you in my life permanently. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to help you teach those children and any others who need teaching. I want to build a life with you here in these mountains. Say yes, Georgia. Please say yes." "Yes," she whispered, and then louder. "Yes, Zachary. Yes to all of it." They were married 3 weeks later by a traveling preacher who came through the ranch on his circuit. Martha stood as witness, along with several of the ranch hands who had become friends to Georgia in her time there. It was a simple ceremony, held in the ranch house parlor with wildflowers decorating every available surface, but it was perfect. Georgia wore a dress of pale blue calico that Martha had helped her sew, and Zachary wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his eyes shining with happiness. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed her with such tenderness that Georgia felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I love you, Mrs. Winston," he murmured against her lips. "I love you too, Mr. Winston," she replied, and they both laughed at the formality of it. The celebration that followed was joyful and relaxed, with a dinner that Martha had spent 2 days preparing and music provided by one of the ranch hands who played the fiddle. They danced in the parlor, Zachary's arms strong around Georgia's waist as he spun her in slow circles. "Are you happy?" he asked as they swayed to the music. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Georgia answered truthfully. "A few months ago I thought my life was over. And now I am married to a wonderful man, I am still teaching those children, and I am part of a family that accepts me completely. It feels like a dream." "If it is a dream, I do not ever want to wake up," Zachary said, pulling her closer. That night in the bedroom that was now theirs to share, Zachary was gentle and patient with Georgia, taking his time to make sure she felt safe and loved. He was careful of her still healing scars, his touch reverent as he explored her body with hands and lips and whispered endearments. Georgia had never felt so cherished, so completely seen and accepted. When they finally came together, it was with a sense of rightness that went beyond the physical, a joining of souls as much as bodies. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window, Zachary traced idle patterns on her arm and said, "I want you to know that I see you, Georgia. Not just the teacher, not just my wife, but the woman who is brave enough to stand up for what is right no matter the cost. I see you, and I am in awe of you." "I see you too," Georgia replied, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. "The man who risks everything to do what is right. The man who saved me and gave me a home. The man I choose every day for the rest of my life." Over the following months, they settled into married life with surprising ease. Georgia continued teaching Samuel, Ruth, and Thomas twice a week in the line shack, and their progress was remarkable. By autumn, all 3 children could read simple books and write complete sentences. Their parents sent messages of gratitude through Zachary, and Georgia felt a deep satisfaction in knowing she was making a real difference in these young lives. The war that everyone had feared began in earnest that spring, with Confederate forces firing on Fort Sumter. California remained in the Union, but the conflict felt distant from their mountain ranch. Still, Zachary worried about being called to fight, about leaving Georgia and the ranch in Martha. He was relieved when the call for volunteers focused on younger men and those in the cities, leaving ranchers and farmers to continue their vital work of providing food and supplies. Georgia threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, learning from Martha how to preserve food for winter, how to doctor sick cattle, how to manage the household accounts. She discovered a talent for breeding horses, developing an eye for good bloodlines and strong conformation. She and Zachary began building up the ranch's horse herd with an eye toward selling quality mounts to the Army, a business decision that proved both profitable and patriotic. In the winter of their first year of marriage, Georgia realized she was pregnant. She told Zachary one snowy evening as they sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind howl outside. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it over her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. Sometime in early summer, I think." The expression on Zachary's face was one of pure wonder. "A baby," he repeated as though he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Georgia asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Zachary said, gathering her into his arms. "I am terrified and thrilled and grateful beyond words. A baby, Georgia. Our baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Georgia had to reluctantly suspend her teaching sessions with the children as she grew larger and less mobile. She worried about them losing momentum in their studies, but Zachary brought her news that Thomas had been teaching other children on the Hutchinson property, passing on what he had learned. The knowledge was spreading, person to person, despite all efforts to stop it. "They cannot hold back the tide," Georgia said with satisfaction. "Education is like water. It finds a way through." Their son was born on a warm June morning in 1862, after a labor that lasted 12 hours and left Georgia exhausted but exhilarated. Zachary stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with cool cloths, while Martha delivered the baby with capable hands. "You have a son," Martha announced, placing the squalling infant on Georgia's chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Georgia looked down at her son through tears of joy, marveling at his tiny, perfect features, his shock of dark hair, his powerful lungs. Zachary leaned over them both, one hand gently touching the baby's head, his eyes wet with emotion. "What should we name him?" Georgia asked. "I was thinking about my father," Zachary said softly. "His name was Daniel James Winston, but only if you like it." "I love it," Georgia said. "Daniel James Winston. Welcome to the world, little one." Being parents changed them both in ways they could not have anticipated. The sleepless nights, the constant worry, the overwhelming love they felt for this tiny person who depended on them completely. But it also brought them closer together, creating a bond that went beyond romance into something deeper and more enduring. When Daniel was 3 months old, Georgia began teaching again, bringing the baby with her to the line shack. Samuel, Ruth, and Thomas were delighted to see her and fascinated by the baby. They took turns holding him carefully while Georgia conducted lessons, and she realized that they were learning something beyond reading and writing. They were learning that families came in all configurations, that love was the thing that mattered, that their teacher trusted them enough to bring her most precious treasure into their presence. The war dragged on, year after year, and they heard news of terrible battles and enormous casualties. The ranch remained a haven of peace and productivity, though they contributed what they could to the war effort. They sold horses to the Army, sent money to support soldiers' families, and prayed for the conflict to end. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and though it did not immediately affect California, Georgia wept when she heard the news. It was a step in the right direction, a recognition that enslaved people were human beings deserving of freedom. She redoubled her teaching efforts, adding more students as word spread that the Winston Ranch was a safe place to learn. Zachary built a larger schoolhouse on their property, away from prying eyes but accessible to those who needed it. On Saturday afternoons, Georgia taught reading and writing to anyone who came, regardless of age or background. Former slaves, Chinese railroad workers, Mexican laborers, children from poor families in town. Everyone was welcome at her school, and Zachary made it clear that anyone who had a problem with that would have to answer to him. Their second child, a daughter they named Grace, was born in the spring of 1864. She had Georgia's red gold hair and Zachary's storm gray eyes, and she was as sweet-tempered as Daniel was energetic. Georgia juggled motherhood and teaching with Martha's help, and she often thought about how blessed she was to have found this life. The war finally ended in 1865, with the Union victorious and slavery abolished throughout the nation. Georgia and Zachary celebrated with quiet gratitude, knowing that the road ahead would still be difficult but hopeful that real change was possible. Samuel, Ruth, and Thomas had grown into confident readers and writers, and Thomas went on to become a teacher himself, opening a school for black children in Sacramento. He wrote to Georgia regularly, telling her about his students and thanking her for giving him the foundation he needed to pursue his dream. "You changed my life," he wrote in one letter. "You risked everything to teach me to read, and now I get to pass that gift on to others. I will never forget what you did for me, for all of us. You are my hero, Miss Georgia." Georgia kept that letter in a special box along with all the others she received from former students over the years. Each one was a reminder that her suffering had meant something, that the scars on her back represented not defeat but victory. As the years passed, the Winston Ranch thrived. Zachary expanded their cattle and horse operations, earning a reputation for honest dealing and quality stock. Georgia's school grew to include nearly 30 regular students, and she hired 2 assistants to help manage the classes. They built a proper schoolhouse with desks and chalkboards and shelves full of books, funded by donations from supporters throughout California. Daniel and Grace grew up surrounded by books and learning, by the example of parents who believed in justice and equality. Daniel showed an early aptitude for working with animals and spent his days shadowing his father around the ranch. Grace, meanwhile, loved school as much as her mother did and often helped teach the younger students. In 1870, Georgia gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Samuel and Martha, honoring the people who had shaped their lives so profoundly. Martha Winston cried when she learned the baby girl would carry her name, and young Samuel's parents traveled from Sacramento to meet their namesake. The household was chaotic with 4 children, but it was filled with laughter and love. Zachary proved to be a devoted father, patient and playful with his children, while still maintaining the discipline necessary to teach them right from wrong. Georgia watched him build a treehouse for Daniel, teach Grace to ride, and rock the twins to sleep, and she fell in love with him over and over again. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. "When you pulled me down from that post 10 years ago, did you imagine we would end up here?" "I imagined hoping you would survive," Zachary admitted. "I imagined being angry at the injustice of what had been done to you. But this—" He gestured to the scene before them, to the children and the ranch and the life they had built. "This is beyond anything I could have dreamed. You are beyond anything I could have dreamed." Georgia leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the solid strength of his presence. "I love you," she said simply. "I loved you when you told me to keep teaching them, when you stood up for what was right. I loved you when you asked me to marry you, and I love you now, even more than I did then. You are the best man I have ever known, Zachary Winston. And you are the strongest, bravest, most compassionate woman I have ever known," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I am honored to be your husband, honored to raise children with you, honored to support your work. You have changed this community, Georgia. You have changed lives, and you have certainly changed mine." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. The children's laughter rang out across the yard, pure and joyful, and Georgia felt a deep contentment settle over her. The original Martha Winston passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1873, at the age of 71. Her loss was deeply felt by the entire family, but especially by Georgia, who had come to think of her as a second mother. At the funeral, Georgia spoke about Martha's kindness, her wisdom, her willingness to shelter a stranger and support an unpopular cause. "She taught me what it meant to be brave," Georgia said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Not through grand gestures, but through daily choices to do what was right, to stand by her principles, to open her home and her heart to those in need. I would not be here today if not for Martha Winston, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to live up to her example." After Martha's death, Zachary and Georgia took over full management of the ranch. Their oldest son, Daniel, now 13, took on more responsibilities with the cattle and horses. Grace, at 11, continued helping at the school while also developing an interest in medicine, fascinated by the biology books Georgia ordered for her from San Francisco. The twins, Samuel and Martha, were energetic 5-year-olds who kept everyone on their toes. Young Samuel had his father's quiet strength and his namesake's serious nature, while Martha was outgoing and talkative, always asking questions and demanding explanations for everything. In 1875, Georgia learned she was pregnant again, a surprise at 36 years old, but a welcome one. This baby, another boy they named Henry, was born healthy and strong, completing their family. Henry proved to be the most easygoing of all their children, content to observe the chaos around him with calm interest. The school continued to grow and evolve. Georgia trained several of her former students to become teachers themselves, creating a network of small schools throughout the county. She worked with the local government to establish public education standards and fought for equal access to schooling regardless of race or economic status. In 1878, Georgia was invited to speak at a women's education conference in San Francisco. Zachary insisted on coming with her, bringing along their oldest children so they could experience the city. Georgia spoke about her experiences teaching enslaved children, about the price she had paid, and the rewards she had reaped. She urged the assembled educators to never give up on any student, to recognize the inherent dignity and potential in every person. The speech was met with a standing ovation, and several newspapers printed excerpts. Letters poured in from across the country, from other educators and reformers who had been inspired by her story. Georgia was embarrassed by the attention but grateful for the platform it gave her to advocate for educational equality. Back at the ranch, life continued its steady rhythm. The children grew, the seasons turned, the cattle and horses thrived. Daniel took over more of the ranch operations as Zachary's hair began to show silver at the temples. Grace went to nursing school in Sacramento, determined to become a doctor, despite the obstacles facing women in medicine. The twins showed talent for business, helping negotiate sales and manage accounts. And young Henry proved to have a gift for music, his fiddle playing bringing joy to family gatherings. Through it all, Georgia and Zachary remained deeply connected. They still took evening rides together when time allowed, still sat on the porch talking long into the night, still found excuses to steal kisses when the children were not looking. Their physical relationship remained strong, the passion between them sustained by genuine friendship and deep respect. "I never get tired of you," Zachary told her on their 20th wedding anniversary, as they danced slowly in the barn decorated with lanterns and flowers by their children. "Every day I discover something new to love about you. Every day I am grateful that I was in town that morning, that I had the courage to stand up for you." "And I am grateful that you did," Georgia replied, her arms around his neck, her body pressed close to his. "You gave me back my life, Zachary. You gave me a home and a family and the freedom to continue my work. You gave me love beyond anything I thought possible. I am the luckiest woman alive." In the 1880s, Daniel married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, and they built a house on Winston land, staying close to help manage the growing operation. Grace became one of the first female doctors in California, opening a practice in Sacramento that served all patients regardless of their ability to pay. The twins, Samuel and Martha, went into business together, establishing a successful freight company that transported goods throughout the Sierra Nevada region. And Henry became a music teacher, bringing the arts to rural communities that had little access to cultural enrichment. Georgia and Zachary became grandparents, welcoming a stream of grandchildren who brought new energy and joy to the ranch. They took pride in seeing their values passed down to the next generation, in watching their children and grandchildren treat all people with dignity and respect. The school that Georgia had founded continued to thrive, now run by a board of directors that included several of her original students. It had expanded to include not just basic literacy, but also advanced subjects like mathematics, science, and literature. Scholarships were available for talented students who could not afford tuition, funded by donations from supporters throughout California and beyond. In 1890, Georgia was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of California, recognizing her contributions to education and social justice. The ceremony was held in Berkeley, and her entire family attended, filling several rows of the auditorium. When Georgia walked across the stage to receive her diploma, wearing the traditional cap and gown, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Zachary watched from the front row, tears streaming down his face, his heart nearly bursting with pride. This woman, his wife, his partner, his love, had overcome so much and accomplished even more. She had been whipped for teaching slaves to read, and now she held a doctorate. She had been broken and bleeding in a town square, and now she was being honored by one of the most prestigious universities in the nation. After the ceremony, as they celebrated with family and friends, Zachary pulled Georgia aside for a private moment. "I am so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "So incredibly proud. None of this would have been possible without you," Georgia replied, touching his face tenderly. "You believed in me when I could not believe in myself. You supported my work even when it was dangerous and unpopular. You gave me the space and freedom to pursue my calling while also building a family with me. Everything I have accomplished because you stood beside me." "We stood beside each other," Zachary corrected. "That is what marriage is, Georgia. Standing together through everything, supporting each other's dreams, building a life that reflects both of your values. I am no more responsible for your success than you are for mine. We have been partners from the beginning. They kissed there in the hallway of the university building, surrounded by the buzz of other celebration, but existing in their own private bubble of love and commitment. After nearly 30 years together, the spark between them burned as bright as ever. As they entered their 60s, Georgia and Zachary began to slow down slightly, passing more responsibilities to their children while still remaining active in ranch management and community affairs. They took time to travel, visiting their children and grandchildren, seeing parts of California they had never explored. They went to the coast and walked along the beach, holding hands and watching the waves crash against the rocks. They visited the redwood forests to the north, marveling at the ancient trees that had stood for thousands of years. But they always came back to the ranch, to the mountains they loved, to the home they had built together. The house had been expanded several times over the years, with wings added for visiting family, and a large library that housed Georgia's extensive collection of books. The porch where they had first admitted their love remained her favorite spot, and they could often be found there in the evenings, rocking gently and talking about everything and nothing. In 1895, the town of Murphys held a ceremony honoring Georgia for her 50 years in California and her contributions to education. It was a bittersweet event, as many of the people who had stood by and watched her whipping were long dead, but their children and grandchildren now praised her work and thanked her for her service to the community. The mayor, a young man who had been one of Georgia's students years earlier, gave a speech about how she had changed the culture of the town, had made it a place that valued education and equality. He presented her with a plaque and a key to the city, and Georgia accepted both with grace and humility, but when she spoke, she did not sugarcoat the past. "I stand here today bearing scars from what happened in this town square 54 years ago," she said, her voice still strong at 66. "I was whipped for the crime of teaching children to read, for believing that all people deserved access to education. That was wrong then, and it would be wrong now. I appreciate this honor, but I also want us to remember that progress is not inevitable. We must choose it every day in our actions and our policies. We must stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult." The crowd was silent for a moment after she finished speaking, and then applause erupted, genuine and heartfelt. People lined up afterwards to shake her hand, to tell her how she had influenced their lives, to thank her for her courage and her persistence. Zachary stood beside her through it all, his hand on the small of her back, his presence a constant support. When they finally made it back to the ranch that evening, exhausted but satisfied, they collapsed onto the porch swing together. "That was quite a day," Zachary said, putting his arm around her shoulders. "It was," Georgia agreed, leaning into him. "I never imagined I would live to see the day when Murphys would honor me instead of condemn me." "You earned it," Zachary said firmly. "You earned every bit of recognition you have received. You changed this community, Georgia. You changed countless lives. And you did it all while being an amazing wife and mother and grandmother. You are extraordinary." "We are extraordinary," Georgia corrected with a smile. "Together." They sat together as the stars came out, as they had done thousands of times before, finding comfort and joy in each other's presence. The years had been kind to them overall, bringing challenges certainly, but also tremendous blessings. They had built something beautiful together, a life rooted in love and justice and mutual support. In 1898, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a grand party at the ranch. All 5 of their children came with their families, bringing a total of 14 grandchildren who ran wild through the property, their laughter echoing off the mountains. Former students traveled from across the state to attend, wanting to honor the woman who had given them the gift of literacy and the man who had supported her mission. There was music and dancing, enormous amounts of food and toasts that went on for hours. Daniel spoke about growing up watching his parents work side by side, about learning that true partnership meant supporting each other's dreams. Grace talked about how her mother had taught her that a woman could do anything she set her mind to, could break barriers and change the world. The twins reminisced about childhood adventures and lessons learned. And Henry played a composition he had written especially for the occasion, a beautiful piece that captured the love and devotion his parents shared. When it was Zachary's turn to speak, he stood with Georgia beside him, his hand clasped firmly in hers. 40 years ago, he began, his voice only slightly roughened by age, I married the most remarkable woman I had ever met. She had been whipped for teaching slaves to read, had suffered terribly for doing what was right, and yet she had not given up. She was determined to continue teaching, to keep fighting for justice and equality. I knew then that I wanted to spend my life supporting her mission and loving her with everything I had. He turned to look at Georgia, his eyes shining with emotion. These 40 years have been the greatest adventure of my life. We have built a family together, raised children who share our values, created a community that embraces education and equality. We have faced challenges and celebrated triumphs. We have grown old together, and I would not change a single moment of it. Georgia Rose Winston, you are my partner, my love, my best friend. Here is to 40 more years. The crowd cheered and applauded, but Georgia only had eyes for Zachary. She stood on her toes to kiss him, not caring that everyone was watching, wanting only to express the overwhelming love she felt for this man who had been her rock, her champion, her everything. I love you, she whispered against his lips. Today and always. Today and always, he echoed, and they held each other as their family and friends celebrated around them. As they moved into their 70s, Georgia and Zachary finally fully retired from active work, though they remained engaged with the school and the ranch. They spent their days reading, gardening, playing with grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. Their love had deepened over the decades, becoming something solid and unshakable, a foundation upon which everything else was built. They talked often about the early days, about that morning in the town square when their lives had intersected so dramatically. They marveled at how much had changed, how far they had come, how many lives had been touched by their work. You ever regret it? Zachary asked her one quiet afternoon as they sat by the fire. Teaching those children, knowing what would happen? Never, Georgia said without hesitation. Not for a single moment. Yes, the whipping was terrible. Yes, I carry scars. But I also carry the knowledge that I made a difference, that I helped break chains that had bound people for generations. And I met you because of it, Zachary. I found my life partner, my soulmate, because I was willing to stand up for what was right. How could I ever regret that? I am glad you feel that way, Zachary said softly, because I certainly do not regret anything. You have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1908 with another large gathering, this time including great-grandchildren among the attendees. Georgia was 79 years old, Zachary was 83, and they were still deeply in love. They danced together slowly, carefully, their bodies no longer as strong as they once were, but their connection as powerful as ever. 50 years, Georgia marveled. Half a century together. The best 50 years of my life, Zachary replied. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for sheltering me, Georgia said, her eyes bright with tears. Thank you for telling me to keep teaching them. Thank you for believing in me and supporting me and loving me so completely. You gave me everything, Zachary. We gave each other everything, he corrected gently. That is how love works, Georgia. We built this life together. Zachary passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1910, at the age of 85. Georgia woke to find him gone, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers even in death. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that seemed to consume her entire being. After 60 years of companionship, the loss felt insurmountable, but she was surrounded by love in her mourning. Their 5 children came with their families, filling the house with presents and support. Former students sent letters and visited, sharing memories of how Zachary had helped them, had protected Georgia so she could continue teaching, had been a force for good in the community. At the funeral, Georgia spoke about the man she had loved for nearly 60 years. Zachary Winston was the best man I ever knew, she said, her voice breaking but determined. He was kind and brave and principled. When he saw injustice, he acted. When he saw someone in need, he helped. He sheltered me when I had nowhere else to go. He told me to keep teaching when others wanted me to stop. He built a life with me based on love and mutual respect and shared values. He was my partner in every sense of the word, and I will miss him every day for the rest of my life. She lived for another 2 years after Zachary's death, years filled with family and memories and the satisfaction of a life well lived. The school she had founded was now a permanent institution, serving hundreds of students every year. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried on her legacy of fighting for justice and equality. Georgia Rose Winston passed away in her sleep in 1912, at the age of 83. She died in the house she had shared with Zachary, in the bed they had slept in together for 50 years, surrounded by photographs and mementos of a remarkable life. At her funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives she had touched. Former students, now elderly themselves, spoke about how she had given them the gift of literacy, had opened up worlds of possibility. Her children and grandchildren spoke about her strength, her compassion, her unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The town of Murphys flew its flags at half-mast, honoring the woman who had transformed their community. The school she founded was renamed the Georgia Rose Winston Academy for Learning, ensuring that her name and her legacy would live on for generations. She was buried beside Zachary on a hill overlooking the ranch, with the mountains rising behind them and the valley spreading out below. Their graves were marked with simple headstones that bore their names, their dates, and a single phrase. They stood together for justice and love. In the years that followed, their story became legend in the Sierra Nevada foothills. People told of the teacher who was whipped for teaching slaves to raid, and the cowboy who sheltered her and told her to keep teaching them. They told of a love that began in the darkest moment and grew into something beautiful and enduring. They told of 2 people who changed their community through courage and persistence, an unwavering commitment to their principles. The Winston Ranch remained in the family for generations, still operating as both a cattle ranch and a center for education and community service. The school continued to thrive, expanding its mission but never forgetting its roots. And every year, on the anniversary of that day in the town square when Georgia was whipped and Zachary stepped forward to defend her, students at the academy participated in a day of service, teaching literacy to those who needed it, honoring the legacy of 2 people who had proved that love and justice could change the world. Their great-great-grandchildren walked the same hills, sat on the same porch, and learned the story of how their ancestors had met and fallen in love. They learned about standing up for what is right, about the power of education, about the importance of partnership and mutual respect in relationships. And somewhere in the California mountains, on a hilltop overlooking a valley of golden grass, two simple headstones stood side by side, marking the resting place of two people who had loved each other completely, who had changed their world for the better, and who had proved that courage and compassion could triumph over hatred and ignorance. Their story lived on, inspiring new generations to stand up for justice, to fight for equality, and to believe in the transformative power of love. The end.